Have you ever met a complete stranger who in just a few minutes made you want to become a better person? An old wealthy man stranded under the scorching Kentucky sun? A 13-year-old boy in a worn-out shirt and tattered shoes appeared out of nowhere, patched up the tire, and disappeared like a ghost. He didn't ask for money. He didn't leave his name. He left behind only one thing, something that would change that man's life forever. And if you think this was just a random act of kindness, then you're not ready for what came next. If you've ever believed that kindness can unlock an entirely new chapter in someone's life, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment below. I'm ready to change. Now then, let's begin the story of Declan and Jalen. Declan Hart, a legendary figure in the world of finance, was over 70 years old when he found himself stranded on the side of High Pine Curve, a remote stretch of road where cell signals died. The heat scorched like fire, and his rear left tire was completely flat. His silver Mercedes gleamed under the sun, a symbol of wealth and power. But the man sitting inside looked more like a crumbling statue, hands trembling, unable to fit the jack under the car. His dress shirt clung to his skin, soaked in sweat, but it wasn't the heat that left him frozen. It was the unfamiliar sting of helplessness. A man who had spent his life commanding from a distance, orchestrating power with a phone call, now reduced to waiting. Not just waiting, but unraveling. Each minute gnawed away at his pride, leaving a hollow twist in his chest. Then, from the dust-blurred slope, a boy appeared. Worn-out shirt, thinning soles on his sneakers, but eyes that were anything but ordinary. He didn't beg. He didn't hesitate. He simply looked at the tire, then up at Declan. "Flat tire, sir?" Before Declan could even respond, the boy knelt down, quietly pulled out the jack, and got to work. His hands moved with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Declan just stood there, unsure why his throat felt tight. This boy wanted nothing from him. And when the tire was changed a few minutes later, the boy dusted his hands on his jeans, gave a small smile, and walked away. Like it was nothing, like it didn't even warrant a thank you. That night in his lavish Oak Ridge Hollow estate, Declan couldn't sleep. The amber light above his untouched glass of scotch cast long shadows across the room. This was a man the world had once bowed to, and yet now the quiet smile of a nameless boy had unsettled something deep within him. Something he hadn't felt in years. By morning, Declan couldn't bear it anymore. He got in his car, not to repay a debt, but to reclaim something. Or more accurately, to find himself again. The boy hadn't asked for anything, no questions, not even a glance back. And in that very silence, Declan heard something he hadn't noticed in years, how utterly empty his heart had become. The next morning, the wealthy old man couldn't sit still in his cold, echoing mansion anymore. Declan got in his car and drove back to that road, the one where he'd met Jalen, tracing each blurred memory like smoke in the wind. He stopped at gas stations, diners, one after another. Then in a small roadside cafe near the edge of Windale Creek, an elderly woman behind the counter said something that made his heart catch in his chest. "That boy? That's definitely Jalen Vaughn. Lives with his mom over on Sycamore Lane." When Declan arrived, the old iron gate had no doorbell. He knocked, and behind a weather-worn wooden door, Amara Williams appeared. There was a guarded look in her eyes at first, but when she heard her son's name, something in her face softened, like a canvas touched by the memory of something good. "He helped me yesterday," Declan said, "and I don't think I ever truly thanked him." Amara led him out back to a small patch of yard, a crooked fence, a few scrappy potted plants, and Jalen, quietly repairing each loose board with splinters clinging to his fingers. When he saw Declan, the boy paused and raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you'd come back." "I didn't either," Declan said softly, "but I couldn't not come back." And then something unexpected happened. No small talk, no formalities. They started talking, not as a man who'd been helped and the boy who helped him, but as two people, both carrying a kind of silence they'd never put into words. Amara invited him to stay for lunch. The red brick kitchen, with its soft warmth rising from a bubbling pot of bean soup, felt nothing like the sleek, sterile kitchen in his estate. Yet somehow the clink of spoons, the scent of spices, the simple stories they shared made Declan feel like he was touching something real. Jalen spoke about school, fixing fences for neighbors, and his dream to repair things people have given up on. Declan didn't say much. He just listened and quietly realized maybe he was one of those things. There was something about Jalen that Declan simply couldn't turn away from. It wasn't just the way the boy had knelt down to change a tire with fierce determination. It was the way he stood back up, smiled, as if he had fulfilled some invisible promise to himself. A few days after that warm lunch on Sycamore Lane, Declan returned, this time not empty-handed. He brought renovation blueprints, sample wood panels, and a construction crew who had built luxury resorts around the country. When Amara opened the door, she looked startled. "We're really okay," she said gently. "We don't need anything." But Declan met her eyes and said slowly, "It's not because you need it, it's because you deserve it." And so it began. When the first hammer struck the yard at Laurelwood, Jalen froze. He hadn't asked for this, but he couldn't stop himself from inching closer. The next day, he carried a chisel for one of the workers. The day after that, he was sawing wood under the watchful eye of Caleb Whitaker, the broad-shouldered, aging carpenter with a smile as gentle as a bear's. Caleb watched the way Jalen's eyes lit up while measuring beams, fitting rafters, and said to Declan, "This kid, he's not just curious. He's rebuilding a dream he thought he'd never be allowed to have." And he was right. Jalen didn't waste time on phones or cartoons. Every morning he showed up in the yard like a true apprentice. The little things he did, wiping sweat off Caleb's brow, holding screws for the crew, quietly picking up stray nails. No one asked him to. He just did. That evening, as she was preparing dinner, Amara glanced out the window and saw her son laughing in the golden wash of sunset. She wiped her hands on her apron and whispered softly to herself, "I've never seen him this happy." 3 weeks later, the Elmside veranda looked like something out of a dream. What had once been a crooked, weather-beaten porch with peeling paint and rotting wood now stood proud, reinforced with fresh timber, coated in clean new paint, every plank measured and cut by Jalen's own hands. And there he was, standing tall, beaming as he took in the transformation. Across Sycamore Lane, neighbors gathered. Some brought pies, others small flower pots. Some came just to sit on the steps, sip iced tea, and listen to the echo of children's laughter. This wasn't a construction day anymore. It was a day of healing. An elderly woman clutched Amara's hand, her voice trembling. "You know, today, for the first time, this place feels like a real home." Declan sat quietly on the porch. He wasn't used to this kind of noise, not the clinking of champagne glasses at elegant galas, but the rich, warm hum of real life, filled with real people. Amara walked over and sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on a cold glass of sweet tea. "You gave us hope," she said, "not just by fixing the house, but by seeing something in us that everyone else overlooked." He nodded, but said nothing, because some things are better kept within the heart. A moment later, Jalen walked over, white paint still smudged on his hands, sawdust freckling his cheeks. "Mr. Declan," he said softly, eyes lit up, "I want to do what you do one day. I want to build, to help, to create something that makes people smile." Declan looked at him for a long moment, then placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. His fingers trembled, but his grip was steady. "You already have, Jalen. You're the reason all of this happened." And for the first time in a very long while, Declan didn't feel alone. He wasn't just a man who had come to give. He had become part of something far more beautiful, a chain of connection, hand to hand, heart to heart, built without a single dollar, but rich in everything that truly mattered. That afternoon, Declan drove away from Sycamore Lane, but this time, he didn't head back to Oak Ridge Hollow. Not because he forgot the way, not because something urgent came up, but because deep down, he finally understood. He no longer belonged there. In the rearview mirror, he saw Jalen and Amara standing on the porch of their newly restored home, waving as the breeze gently lifted the white curtain that now hung in the window. What was once a crumbling shelter now glowed, not just from fresh paint, but because the people inside had been seen, believed in, and respected. As he neared the exit to the highway, Declan pulled over. He picked up his phone, hesitating as the name of his old house manager appeared. The man who once chose his wine, booked his meetings, locked the doors at night. But instead of dialing, he turned off the screen, slipped the phone into his pocket, and quietly steered the car back toward Windell Creek. There was no clear reason for returning. No contract, no strategy, no ROI. Only one truth. He had once believed he was old, that the best chapters of his life were already written, that all that was left was waiting. But Jalen, a 13-year-old boy with clear eyes and splintered hands, showed him something different. That as long as you can help someone stand a little taller, you are never useless, never too late, never done. And just like that, the journey he thought had ended was only beginning. Not at the mansion, not in a boardroom, but in a place where one quiet act of kindness had reignited a legacy, not built on wealth, but on humanity. The next morning, Declan woke earlier than usual, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the silence pulsing in his chest. The Oak Ridge Hollow estate, once a fortress of comfort and control, now echoed with the hollow whistle of wind slipping through tall glass windows. The sunlight that poured across the marble floors felt cold, distant, like a spotlight in an empty room. He didn't eat breakfast, didn't carry a schedule. He brought only one thing with him, a quiet resolve to find that boy. He drove back toward High Pine Curve, that winding stretch of road coiled through the valley, where a tire once went flat, and something inside him quietly came undone. But this time, he wasn't looking for a tow truck. He was looking for someone who had helped him, without ever realizing he was saving a soul slowly rotting from the inside out. At every fork in the road, every faded signpost, Declan pulled over and asked. Some shook their heads, others looked at him like he was speaking nonsense. Still, he kept going. There was a moment, stopped at a dirt road intersection, where he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his hands trembled, his chest tightened, and tears welled in his eyes for reasons he couldn't name. Then at Blue Fern Cafe, where a few older folks sipped morning coffee in quiet routine, a woman tilted her head thoughtfully and said, "That boy sounds like Jalen Vaughn, lives with his mama down at the end of Sycamore Lane." Her words pierced through the ice around his heart like an arrow. For the first time in years, Declan exhaled, not out of relief, but with the clarity of knowing he was finally heading the right way. Not on a map, but in his soul. After that brief conversation at Blue Fern Cafe, the name Jalen Vaughn echoed in Declan's mind like the answer to a question he never realized he'd been asking. The woman, Tessa Langford, had pointed him toward Windell Creek, a small town tucked beneath the shadow of Pinecrest Ridge, where, as she put it, the few people left with kindness don't usually need an introduction. As his car turned onto Sycamore Lane, time seemed to slow. Modest houses with sloping roofs, leaning fences, but there was a warmth radiating from the open windows, from a kind of life Declan had lost touch with long ago. Jalen's home was the last on the street, gray stucco walls, a wooden porch bowing slightly with age. Declan parked the car and hesitated. His hand on the door handle felt colder than he expected. Not from the wind, but from the unfamiliarity of knocking on a door that didn't have a butler behind it. The door opened. A woman stood there, hair loosely tied back, eyes ringed with fatigue, but sharp and watchful. "Is your name Jalen?" Declan asked quietly, as if even he couldn't believe he was the one speaking. She nodded, not smiling, but not distant either. "I'm his mother. I'm guessing you're the man he helped the other day." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was filled with things unsaid. Then she stepped aside, voice soft. "He's out back, if you'd like to see him." Declan stepped inside. The house was simple. Weathered wooden floors, patched up walls. But there was a scent here he'd never found in his mansion. The faint smell of slightly burnt toast beneath the oven. The sound of a knife tapping against a cutting board. The scent and sound of a home that was alive. He followed the narrow hallway that opened to the backyard. There Jalen knelt in the dirt, fixing a rotting fence post. He looked up, surprised. but he didn't back away. "You really came back?" Jalen asked. Not boastfully, just a raw, honest question from a boy who had long since learned not to expect people to return. "I did," Declan said, "because I think I've got something left to finish." Declan arrived in Windale Creek early that afternoon. The town felt like it had slipped off the edge of the map. No car horns, no flashing lights, just open doors, shirts drifting gently on clotheslines, and the sound of wind whispering through curved porch eaves. House number 12 at the end of Sycamore Lane was smaller than he expected, but neat and held something in its presence, something that made it impossible for him to turn away. He stepped out of the car, gripping the keys in his hand. Like letting go might mean losing the courage to follow through. The door opened, and a woman's gentle voice invited him in. Not overly warm, not guarded either. Her name was Amara, and her eyes were deep and steady, like someone who had endured more than she ever let on. "Will you stay and eat with us?" The question was simple, but it stopped Declan in his tracks for a moment. No one had invited him to dinner without first calculating how many companies he'd run or how many shares he owned. He nodded, and so they sat down at an old wooden table in the red brick kitchen, where the scent of sizzling butter and vegetable stew mingled in the air. The table had a small crack across its surface. The chair to the left wobbled on one leg. But when Jalen sat across from him and smiled, the whole scene felt more balanced than any elegant banquet Declan had ever attended. Jalen talked about school, not in the way most kids did. He didn't mention grades, but spoke of helping the janitor fix the lights in the classroom and replacing the old storeroom door for the librarian. Amara chimed in with gentle stories. How Jalen once slipped bread to the elderly neighbor with a broken leg, or spent the summer clearing out the church garden, unasked, unseen. Declan didn't say much, but something inside him softened. As if, without realizing it, he had just set down a heavy, invisible weight he'd been carrying for decades. Amara Williams, the woman with seasoned eyes and hands that never seemed to rest, looked at Declan with guarded caution as she opened the door. Sunlight angled over her shoulder, catching the silver strands tucked neatly into her tied-back hair. She wasn't hostile, but she didn't smile either, like someone far too familiar with the way the world tends to arrive, and then quietly leave. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, her voice low and raspy, just above a whisper. "Jalen," Declan replied, the name unfamiliar on his tongue, yet somehow it carried the warmth of an old melody. Something shifted in her then, not quite a smile, more a softening, like a cup of tea selling after the boil. She stepped aside and opened the door wider. "He's out back. If you're not in a rush, I'm making lunch." Declan stepped over the threshold, surprised at how much his heart trembled. The scent of sizzling shallots, steaming rice, the clang of pots. It all made him feel like a child again, stepping into someone's home after being lost for far too long. While Jalen stayed busy in the backyard, fixing the base of the fence, Amara washed vegetables at the sink. Her eyes flicked toward Declan now and then through the stream of running water. No unnecessary questions, no showy curiosity. Just the quiet presence of a mother trying to understand why a stranger had come back. Just to say thank you. "You're the one he mentioned," she said, not turning around. "He doesn't talk much, but I heard it in how he told the story. It meant something to him." Declan eased into a wooden chair by the table. Not quite naturally, but not awkwardly either. He looked around the red brick kitchen, where everything was old, yet nothing felt temporary. "It meant something to me, too," he said softly. "Maybe even more than it did to him." Out in the Laurelwood yard, Jalen was repairing a rotted fence post, where old wooden slats had splintered and paint had peeled away in patches. He didn't look up when Declan approached. He simply kept tightening bolts, his hands steady, moving with the quiet rhythm of someone used to doing things on their own. Not expecting help, not needing anyone to notice the effort. "Have you ever fixed a fence?" Jalen asked suddenly, eyes still focused on the beam. The question made Declan pause. In all his years of leadership, he'd built multinational empires, but he had never once felt the weight of driving a nail straight into wood. "No," he said quietly, more honestly than he expected, "but sometimes I wish I had." Jalen turned to glance at him, tilting his head in that curious, almost knowing way that reminded Declan how often adults underestimate how deeply children can see. "That's okay," the boy said. "Some things, the later you learn, the longer they stick." The response caught Declan off guard, not just because it came from a child, but because it struck something deep inside him, something long buried. A quiet regret for the relationships he'd let slip away while chasing a version of success that never truly filled him. In the silence that followed, the sound of Jalen's hammering took on a rhythm, like background music, not loud but quietly profound. "I learned to fix this from my grandpa," Jalen added. "He said a house isn't where you live, it's what you take care of." Declan didn't respond right away, but something inside him shifted. In the wind, in the tapping of wood, and in Jalen's clear, steady gaze, he no longer felt like a man who had come to say thank you. He felt like someone being taught, again from the beginning, by the quietest lessons of all. After lunch in the red brick kitchen of house number 12, Declan stayed a while longer. Jalen had run back outside to finish the fence, and Amara washed dishes in the old steel sink that creaked with every shift of water. Everything felt simple, yet for Declan, it was the first time in years he didn't feel the urge to leave the moment a conversation ended. He stood and stepped onto the porch. The breeze slipped through the sheer curtains, and in front of him was Jalen, trying to drive nails into a warped board, the hammer almost too big for his hand. Every swing tugged at something in Declan's chest. Not because Jalen was struggling, but because he did it all without complaint, without asking for help. As if he'd long accepted that doing things alone was just how life worked. That afternoon, back in his car, Declan didn't start the engine right away. He sat still, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the reflection of the house in his rearview mirror. It might have once been beautiful, but now its roof sagged, the porch slumped, the walls chipped and tired, like a person who had once been strong, but had gone too long without being cared for. And he thought, if it only takes a few $1,000s to repair a place that still holds everything good, then why not? But just as the thought flickered, an old voice inside him rose, cold and sharp. "Are you pitying them?" Number, not this time. He wanted to do it. Not because Jalen needed it, but because Jalen deserved it. Because in a world that often rewards the loudest, the richest, the cruelest, Jalen had quietly taught him something no boardroom ever had. That kindness doesn't need anything to exist. But when it's passed on, it becomes legacy. Declan unlocked his phone, and for the first time since retirement, he made a call to an old contractor. "I need a few good people," he said, "to go to a very small town and fix something very big." As the crew began measuring the back roof line, Declan sat beside Amara on the worn wooden steps. Jalen was carefully moving planks, working as part of the team, while Caleb, the lead carpenter Declan had brought in, guided him through each step with patient precision. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting broken patches of gold across the yard. Imperfect, but real. Amara poured 2 glasses of iced tea and placed one beside Declan. Her voice came slowly, like she was simply letting a thought unfold aloud. "There was a time I didn't think I was strong enough to raise him on my own." Declan turned to her, but said nothing. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because her eyes didn't need comfort. They needed presence. They needed to be heard. "Jalen's never met his father," she continued, "and I worked 2 jobs back to back during those early years. There were nights I'd fall asleep sitting by the door, partly afraid of break-ins, but mostly because if I lay down, I wouldn't have the strength to get back up." Her voice didn't shake, but as she reached that point, her hand gently tightened around the glass of tea. "We don't have much, but I always told Jalen this. If you can't repay life for its kindness, then at least don't owe anyone a debt of bitterness." Declan bowed his head slightly. He had never heard anyone say it like that. Not a lesson about avoiding pain or escaping poverty, but about choosing kindness, even when no one's watching. And maybe that was what had shaped Jalen. They sat in silence for a while. There was no need for more words, because what had just been shared wasn't for sympathy. It was a quiet carving of truth, a reminder that everything Jalen carried in his steady hands, his grace, his skill, and the courage in his eyes. It hadn't come from chance. It had come from a mother who had once stood alone against the world, simply to keep one roof standing. Returning from Windale Creek, Declan sat silently in his study, a glass of scotch in hand, its ice long since melted. The sunset filtered through the tall windows of his estate, casting the room in a somber orange glow. But for the first time, he didn't see it as beautiful. He thought of the sagging porch at house number 12, of the steady rhythm of hammering, and of Amara's soft smile as she spoke about nights spent choosing between fixing the plumbing or buying milk for her son. And he knew this couldn't be just a touching visit wrapped up with a bow. It couldn't end like that. The next morning he returned to Sycamore Lane, not empty-handed this time. A truck loaded with materials, a crew of builders, printed blueprints. Every detail was in motion. But this wasn't the work of a wealthy man trying to make a gesture. It was the quiet commitment of someone who had been awakened by a small act of kindness that felt more real than anything he'd known in years. When the construction team arrived, Amara came rushing out, her face a blend of shock and confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low, uncertain. "We've always managed." Declan didn't smile, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her gently and said, "I know, but you shouldn't have to just manage. Not after living with that much kindness for so long." Jalen stood on the porch, hands still smeared with joint compound, watching as ladders came down and bags of cement were unloaded. He looked at his mother, then back at Declan, his gaze caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. And in that look, Declan finally understood. He wasn't helping a poor family. He was repaying a silent debt, a debt of kindness. A week later, the hum of engines and the thud of tools echoed down Sycamore Lane. The supply truck came to a stop in front of house number 12, and Caleb Whitaker, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, stepped down like a man who had built entire worlds with nothing but his hands and a lifetime of patience. Amara stood on the porch, still wiping her hands on her apron, eyes glassy. Not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being the center of care. Jalen said nothing. No questions, no outbursts of joy. But the light in his eyes betrayed him. He couldn't hide the anticipation. He stood close to Declan, quietly watching every plank, every tool unloaded, as if each hammer was a key, unlocking something new and sacred. Caleb stopped beside him, looked down, and pulled the pencil from behind his ear. "You know how to measure a board, kid?" he asked. Jalen blinked. "I do." Caleb didn't smile, didn't pat his head. He simply handed him a measuring tape. "Good, start here." From that moment, Jalen was swept into a feeling he'd never quite known before. The feeling of being trusted, of being given responsibility, of being heard. He was no longer just the boy who patched the porch with his mother. He was now part of rebuilding his home, with his hands, with his heart, and with new lessons taught by the seasoned craftsman at his side. Declan watched from a distance, a strange emotion rising in his chest. Not the pride of someone giving charity, but the deep, quiet ache of someone witnessing a seed finally breaking through earth that had gone dry for far too long. From the very first morning, when the sound of hammers echoed across the Sycamore Lane yard, Jalen was already there. Even though Declan had gently said, "You don't have to do anything today, Jalen. Just enjoy being a kid." 10 minutes later, the boy was quietly circling Caleb like a small bird, hovering near a brand new nest. At first, Caleb only chuckled, saying nothing. But when he saw Jalen carefully picking up scattered wood pieces, collecting fallen nails, eyes glued to every drill, every measurement, every cut, he sighed, then handed the boy a small pair of gloves. "Might as well put you to work," Caleb mumbled, though the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the kind of smile only an old teacher gives when he knows. Some kids don't need to be taught. They just need to be given a chance. From that day on, Jalen was no longer an observer. He became part of the crew. He was the one jotting down measurements, learning how to use a square, understanding which screws belonged in door frames and which ones held floorboards steady. He didn't say much, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. From inside the kitchen, Amara watched through the window, her hand resting on the sill, her heart skipping a beat. And when Declan stepped into the room, she looked at him, not with the gaze of someone receiving charity, but with the trembling emotion of a mother seeing her child, for the first time, shine in the place where he truly belonged. "I've never seen him this happy," she whispered. Declan said nothing. He just looked out to the yard, where Jalen stood next to Caleb, carefully measuring the front porch beam. And he knew he saw it too. It wasn't a burst of excitement. It was something deeper. The quiet joy of a child who had just found the one thing that made him want to grow up. Beneath the soft golden light of early morning, the steady buzz of sawing wood echoed from the corner of the yard. Caleb, calm as ever with a familiar pencil tucked behind his ear, knelt beside Jalen, his focus unwavering. Jalen was no longer the boy who helped fix a fence. Now he stood tall, one hand holding the square, his voice repeating measurements with the precision of someone who'd done it 100 times before. Caleb watched him for a moment, then gave a quiet nod. "Better than yesterday," he said. Not loud, not showy, but just enough to make Jalen's smile light up like the morning itself had been waiting for it. "Want to know why we're cutting at a 45 and not a 90? Jalen nodded immediately, like it was second nature to hunger for knowledge. This wasn't simple curiosity anymore. This was passion, that rare kind of spark you don't see often, but when it shows, it's so bright the world seems to pause just to witness it. Amara stood inside, drying her hands on her apron, watching silently. And Declan, from the old wooden chair shaded beneath the tree, couldn't take his eyes off the boy, afraid that blinking might mean missing something quietly miraculous taking shape before him. Caleb placed a firm hand on Jalen's shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "when I was your age, I started in a yard just like this, and I never walked away from wood and nails again." Jalen didn't answer. He simply bent back down and kept measuring. But the smile lingering on his lips said more than words ever could. It was a silent promise to himself that there would be many more homes, many more verandas, and he would build them with his own two hands. The day of completion arrived beneath soft, gentle sunlight. House number 12 on Sycamore Lane no longer resembled the weary, crumbling home it once was. The new oak-colored veranda shimmered beneath the sun, the porch freshly leveled and smooth, a long wooden bench placed neatly across it, now echoing with the laughter of children, the clinking of soda glasses, and the scent of fresh baked pies carried on the breeze. Veranda Elmside, a name Declan had once tossed out half-jokingly days earlier, had now become something real. It wasn't just a porch anymore. It was a space of connection, a new heartbeat for the neighborhood. Neighbors arrived, one with a basket of apples, another balancing a homemade apple pie, someone else bringing a lavender plant to sit in the corner of the deck. An elderly man slowly placed an old ceramic oil lamp on the table and said softly, "This belonged to my father. I think it belongs here now." Jalen darted across the yard, proudly gripping the worn wooden hammer Caleb had given him as a keepsake. He pointed out every new corner to his friends like he had built it all himself. And truthfully, in many ways, he had. Amara stood beside Declan, and the smile on her lips was no longer just gratitude. It was something deeper. She leaned in and whispered, "I don't know how you did it, but you brought back something I thought was gone forever. Hope." Declan said nothing. He didn't need to, because in that moment he knew this wasn't just the restoration of a house. He had helped bring an entire community back to life. The afternoon settled gently, sunlight pooling into golden streaks beneath the eucalyptus trees in the backyard. On the newly built porch, gleaming, sturdy, still rich with the scent of fresh pine, Declan sat in quiet stillness, cradling a glass of iced tea. The ice nearly melted. His eyes stayed fixed on the scene before him. Jalen laughing with the neighborhood kids, swinging high on a swing set he once only dared to dream of. Beside him, Amara sat down, quietly as if afraid to disturb something sacred unfolding in front of them. After a long pause, she spoke, still watching her son, her voice low, trembling slightly. "You know, you didn't just fix a house." Her words came slowly, filled with something deeper than gratitude. "You rebuilt my faith in the future, in the goodness I'd forgotten could still exist." Declan didn't respond right away. He gripped the glass a little tighter, his eyes, once sharp with the chill of a seasoned businessman, now softened, vulnerable. "I used to think I understood the meaning of success," he said quietly. "But today I realized real success is helping someone stand tall with nothing expected in return." Amara turned to him then, eyes brimming. Not with sorrow, but with the kind of tears that come when someone reminds you you're not alone. "You gave us hope, Declan," she whispered. "Not because you had money, but because you chose not to walk away." And Declan, once a man who believed he was too old to change, felt something stir at deep in his chest, like breath returning after too long held in. In that fading afternoon light, he was no longer a stranger on the porch. He was part of something far greater, something real, something home. The late afternoon breeze drifted gently across the newly built porch, carrying with it the scent of fresh wood and the lingering echoes of laughter from the backyard. Jalen sat on the steps beside Declan, streaks of blue paint still smudged on his hands, eyes lifted toward the older man, with a sincerity rare for any 13-year-old. "I don't know why, but," Jalen's voice trembled, though his gaze glowed with clarity, "I think someday I want to do what you're doing. I want to help someone, not because they're pitiful, but because they deserve it." Declan turned to look at him, his aging eyes locking on to the boy's, as if for a moment he was seeing a reflection of himself from a lifetime ago, back when he still believed in something greater than profit. He placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to wait for someday, Jalen," he said softly. "You already have." Jalen blinked, puzzled. "But I just fixed a fence, helped paint a wall." Declan smiled, not the polished smile of a man who'd mastered boardrooms, but the quiet smile of someone who had finally learned what it meant to leave a real mark on someone's life. "You made someone feel like they weren't alone, like someone out there genuinely cared." He paused, his voice steadier now. "And sometimes, Jalen, that saves a person's whole life." Jalen looked down, silent, but his chest tightened, not with confusion, not with pride from being praised, but with a feeling he'd never quite known until now. Pride. Not for being noticed, but for being understood. Late afternoon. Declan stood by the wooden gate on Sycamore Lane, gazing at the house now wearing its new skin, not just in color but in laughter echoing from the yard, in the hope shining through the eyes of a once guarded woman, and in the way a young boy had learned how to dream bigger. He opened the car door, his hand gliding across the steering wheel, then paused, not out of reluctance, but out of gratitude. As the wheels rolled down the road heading south, Declan didn't feel like he was leaving. For the first time in years, he felt like he was going home, not to the cold stone mansion in Oak Ridge Hollow, but to a place where he still mattered, where his name meant something, not for the money behind it, but for the way he had chosen to live. In the rearview mirror, he saw Jalen run out onto the porch, waving. Declan smiled, then whispered to himself, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning of a new chapter, where kindness has the power to rewrite entire lives." If you've ever believed that one small act can change someone's fate, tell us your story below. We'd love to listen. And if this ending made your heart fall silent for just a moment, hit that follow button. Not because we need more subscribers, but because stories like this deserve to keep being told. Are you ready for the next one? Some encounters seem like chance, yet they quietly unlock doors for someone who's been lost. And the story of old Declan Hart and young Jalen Vaughn is proof of that. A man who once lived in luxury, but felt utterly alone. A boy who grew up with little, yet carried a spirit that could move mountains. Between two generations, two different worlds, they shared nothing, except a kind of kindness that asked for nothing in return. Jalen didn't help Declan because he expected something back. He simply did what was right. And that simple act touched a heart that had gone cold, a heart that believed its best days were behind it. But through the rebuilding of a house, Declan found something far greater, a reason to exist, not in the wealth he owned, but in how he used it to rebuild hope for someone else. This story reminds us of a truth so simple, yet so often forgotten in our fast-moving world. Helping someone isn't just about giving. It's also how we rediscover the best part of ourselves. And sometimes the greatest lessons come from a young boy A quiet act. A moment no one else sees. A life can change because of one tightened bolt on a roadside under the midday sun. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? If you have, share it. Because maybe, just maybe, your story is exactly what someone else needs to begin again.